IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, where we discuss about policy issues and current issues of importance. Today on this episode, we are going to talk about the need for sex education in India, and I will be joined by Mahek, who is my colleague at the Takshashila Institution. Welcome, Mahek, and let's immediately get started into the topic, right? So when we talk about sex education, we are sort of like constricted with that idea, right? So here, when we are discussing like the need for sex education, what exactly are we talking about, Mahek? Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah. So, like, when we speak about sex education, like, the first thing which comes to a lot of people's mind is that it's merely associated with sex, which is
Yeah.
entirely wrong, which is not. Sex education is much more beyond just talking about intimacy issues or sex issues. And that's why we also have spoken about, and a lot of people have spoken about having an introduction of sex education very early in a person's life.
Right.
So, sex education talks about, first of course, it talks about one's own sexual and reproductive health, which can be maintained once a person reaches a certain age in their lives. But it's much more beyond that, in the sense like sex education also helps to understand topics as important but as neglected as how gender is more than just binary. Even if you see in a lot of books in the curriculum when children are young, you'll see that there are two genders defined, either a boy or a girl. So sex
Right.
education also teaches us that the gender is not, it's actually non-binary. We cannot see it with a binary lens. And then if you also see, like, probably one of the most important things that sex education includes is also about good touch, bad touch, right? And we also
Yeah.
know that there is a lot of child molestation which happens at a very young age. And how do you expect a 3-year-old or 4-year-old to realize what is right and what is wrong? Probably what is done in love and probably what is not done in love, right? So sex
Right.
education also talks about that. And but there is also a need that is felt that sex education should not only be restricted to good touch and bad touch. And that's why it's very important for adolescents or teenagers who are just exposed to the idea of sex, to let them know about these sexually transmitted diseases, to let them know about unwanted pregnancies or contraception,
Right.
because that at the end of the ulterior motive of everyone who's in governance or who's in administration, the end motive is to have a healthier population, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
until and unless your teenagers or the young population that you're targeting, I call them young adults. I don't call them
Right.
children or I don't call them adults. I just call them young adults, because
Yeah.
I think they're at this right age when they will. They're, of course, with this boom of social media, they're exposed to so many things, which,
Right.
and one cannot actually always scrutinize what they're watching or what they're up to. And that's why sex education comes into play. And it's
Right.
also important because it also teaches one how to be respectful and how to be communicative about relationships, how to be consistent. And that's why I say sex education is, you're not just telling people how to have safe sex and maintain their own reproductive health. It's much more beyond that, and it ultimately aims for a healthier population.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Mahek. Actually, like when we talk about sex education, the points that you've raised is extremely important, right? And one of the biggest questions when it comes about sex education, apart from understanding what sex education should actually entail, I think the biggest question now is like what age, sex education should start, like at what age is the right age. And personally, I believe that, it should start at a very young age, like you mentioned, because for small kids who are 3 4 years old or 5 years old, understanding the distinction between good touch and a bad touch is important. And as they grow up and as they mature, understanding, having a holistic approach towards sex education also helps them view sex and sexuality as a normal human process, and they are less likely to fall victim to these false information, right? And generally, like when there is not enough information about this subject, when it is not taught right, young adults especially, they lean back to popular culture or like porn and stuff for to get more information about it. And then there's a huge volume of like false information there. And then the normalcy that we're looking for in terms of like sexual identity, gender identity, and whole sexuality in as a spectrum, all of that sort seem gets distorted, and multiple problems arise because of that. And also, like, studies have shown that when you start conversations from a very young age regarding sexual health and sexual intimacy and sex education, there is also like decrease in cases of sexual abuse, because now kids can openly talk about it. They can talk to their parents or the older people that they're more comfortable with. So it sort of bridges the gap that is already present in today's world when it comes to sex education. And also, sex as a whole is seen as a taboo in India as well as in and around, I believe, in and around the world. But India, especially given how conservative society that we live in, I think initiating these conversations at a very young age will help these kids when they grow up and when they become adults, right?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah, sorry,
having
one
said,
second. Sorry to cut you off like
yeah,
that. But like you mentioned a very important point that if parents or teachers don't teach children or probably early teenagers at the
right.
right age, they'll of
Hmm.
course move towards pop culture and as you correctly mentioned, probably towards porn. And it's not like that. It's so unrealistic when
Right.
we see all of those things, and that's how they learn and that's how they think that it happens, but that might not be always true. And
Yeah.
like that's why if you see that the data in the country, like there have been studies where it has been shown that not even like teenagers or young adults, it's also like adults who have really bad information on sexual and
Right.
reproductive health, and that's
Yeah.
what it shows in the data itself. And like I imagine it might be true for you also. I didn't learn about all of these things, sexual and reproductive health, from my school. I also
Same.
remember when
Yeah.
I was in, yeah, correct, right? We
Right.
actually were dependent on external sources, which can be our friends, probably their friends, or our
Yeah.
elder siblings, or of course then we at my age we also had access to Instagram and all of these
Yeah.
networking
Yeah.
sites, so we did have access to it. I remember two things from my school. Once when I was in 8th grade or probably
Right.
ninth grade, there was of course there was a chapter in biology when that everybody talks about it.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
ninth grade, was there something on this? There's a chapter associated with reproductive health, and that was a fictional chapter in Hindi language. And
Okay.
my teacher chose to skip that chapter.
Right.
And since we, yeah,
And also, like, I think to add to that point, I remember the first time we had like a sex ed in double quotation, if I may say. It was in around seventh grade when, we had like the reproductive systems in
chapter, yeah,
organisms, right? And
yeah, true.
teachers, like, especially like my science teacher, who I do respect a lot for her, for all the information she gave on like science and stuff like that, for my initial love for science began in school. But like, for example, when it came to that chapter, when it came to asexual reproduction, it was given so much importance, right? But the minute like human reproduction came, it was
Mm-hmm.
limited to understanding the reproductive anatomy of a male and a female. But beyond that, it was not anything to do with sexual health or anything of that sort. And in fact, even in like sixth standard, typically a time when a lot of teenage girls start having their menstruation and stuff, right? So we would have
Mm-hmm.
this thing where the boys were sent off to like PT classes, and girls were taken to the library, and we were given like a
Yeah,
brief introduction about what periods are and what pads are and what exactly happens to your body. But beyond that, what exactly are the complications with respect to like your sexual organs? Like, what are the signs you need to look for? All of these things I got to know, I think, after I started my bachelor's, or in fact after that, because of conversations with friends and sort of normalizing it within our friends group, right?
true.
And
And I think a lot of teenagers, boys especially, are so insensitive to these topics when we even talk about periods or uh,
exactly.
because they're not aware of it, and for them all of these things are so alienating, or they probably have just seen these advertisements on, which I find, like, talking about, like, when we talk about advertisements, to me, if we may digress a little, for me all
Yeah.
of these sanitary napkin advertisements are too problematic. Like,
Oh,
when
definitely. Yeah.
you show, okay, have the sanitary napkin, and then you're gonna have like a full-fledged, like, have fun day. You're gonna climb the mountains, probably ride a
Yeah.
motorcycle. That doesn't happen. That really doesn't happen, and it's so problematic for, especially, like, probably you and I have been in that age for more than like a decade, so we know how it
Right.
really functions. But for young people, it's so misleading. It really isn't like
Exactly.
that. A lot of
Yeah,
times,
yeah,
I just
yeah.
don't want to get out of my bed and like work because it's so painful, and men or probably other people are so insensitive about it because they see, okay, these are the things, or just have a medicine, and it doesn't work like that at all.
Exactly.
So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Definitely. And also, like, I think when, like, we talk about sex ed, right? One more thing, when we're talking about like teenage kids and adults also, like you mentioned, a lot of adults also do not understand sex ed like properly, right? And that also leads to problem with understanding the concept of consent. And
exactly.
that is also like a huge issue, right? Because these are the things that need to be talked about in sex education. Understanding what intimacy is, understanding what consent is, an integral part of sex education also, which has never been touched. I think the concept of consent has only started becoming like a mainstream topic after the whole Me Too movement
Me Too
began,
movement,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
Yeah, until then no one really talked about consent. And even like when it comes to consent, so much about it is so vague in a lot of people's mind. They don't really understand what consent is, because if you talk about like, and then it comes to like, if digress a little, it also comes to the whole concept of, because people do not understand the concept of consent, there's no conversation about marital rape that happens. There's no conversation about so many social issues which stems from the lack of sex ed, right?
Yeah. And when you talk about marital rape, I think it was a month and a half before when we had all this discussion on Twitter and on social
Yeah, yeah,
media
yeah. Yeah.
about marital rapes, right? And I
Right.
remember, like, people like from various political parties, I don't want to take names, but like
Yeah.
in 2016, 2017, they have openly spoken about probably institutionalizing the institution of marriage, and they're talking about
Right.
how holy it is. And if we talk about marital rape, then the consent doesn't really work. I just didn't get the idea of, like, how even having a discussion about it and in then against is just a topic of debate, because it
Yeah,
shouldn't
I
be,
don't
right?
understand the whole concept of debate regarding it, right? Because the entire conversation was about criminalization of marital rape, but a lot of people seem to be against it, against the criminalization, and I don't understand why exactly was it a point of contention in the first place,
True,
right?
and that's why we know that things as basic as consent, but they also play a very, very important role, should be ingrained and taught to students when they are in the learning stage. If you teach them,
Right.
if you tell men all of these things at 30, 35, they might not take it so easily. But if you tell them all of these things, you have been telling them probably when they're 9, they're 10, they will realize the importance of it. And since
Yeah.
we don't, they never end up doing it. And we know that marital rape is one of the biggest societal problems that we face. And the even bigger problem is people don't want to talk about it, because marriage in our country, across the world, across religions, is seen as a holy institution, which it can be.
Yeah.
I am not
Yeah.
pointing
Yeah.
about talking about marriage
Right.
as an institution. I'm just talking about the idea of consent and how, and as an individual, we don't believe in it. And I remember,
Exactly.
it's like, it's just an instance that I have from my school. I remember when I was in my 12th grade, and you know how we have these head girls and head boys. So the
Yeah. Yeah.
committee, the
Yeah.
student
Yeah.
committee, we decided to probably start sex education classes for students of 8th and 9th, because that's the age they enter into 13, 14. And you know that
Right.
this is the age
Yeah.
they're going to learn about new things. This is the age they're going to hang out with their elder friends who are going to teach them, and they'll be exposed to the content, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
to my surprise, there was so much bashing from parents, like from
Right.
a lot of parents, that we ended up never having it. And
Yeah.
now my brother is within the same school, and it's been like what, almost 8 years since I passed, 7 years, and it's
Yeah.
still not there. It's
Yeah,
still not
it's
done.
actually not, and that actually brings me to a very important point, this conversation, because at the 1994 United Nations International Conference on Population and Development, which is ICPD, this included India as well, right? The sexual and reproductive rights of adolescents and young people were like affirmed, and in this conference it was sort of understood that for adolescents and for youth to be able to make informed decisions on all matters concerning their sexuality and reproduction, they needed to have like a comprehensive education on sexuality. Now, like because therefore, like as a part of their commitments under the ICPD agenda, the governments were obliged to provide free and compulsory comprehensive sexuality and sex education for adolescents and young people, right? They targeted that age group. And after that, the government of India actually initiated an adolescent education program in 2007. And however, like you said, right, like you're in school also, a lot of parents and all were against this. Similarly, here, the program was banned by like a majority of states due to a lot of protests and moral policing and stuff, because they thought that the contents of this program was inappropriate. And like now, though, like the program had covered the issues of like body image, violence and abuse, gender and sexuality, sexually transmitted infections, etc., it sort of left out one of the most important things like involved, like consent regarding like intimate relationships. And I come from a CBSE school, all right, and in fact, like even there we didn't have like a comprehensive proper like sex education as such. Like I mentioned before, right? It was just like one chapter in a science textbook that was just skipped because the teachers were like, oh, because like there would be cases where they would start talking about something remotely related to sex education, and like you would see people smirking. You could see like kids, because that is like a very, I don't know, a topic of that people shy away from. And the minute like the teacher saw some smirks from my classmates and stuff, that the teacher was like, oh, it seems like you guys know everything about it, so I'm just gonna skip it through. And we like didn't sit right, because at that age is when adolescent and teenage is a highly vulnerable time for young adults, to understand these concepts and stuff. So it was quite surprising that this topic has not, and this was what I finished my schooling 10 years ago, and 10 to like 12 years ago, and even to this day my siblings go to the same school, and they don't have anything as like the sexual education at all.
Yeah, and when you were talking about like that students having the smirk or they shying away from these things, that also brings the point to the point that we started with this conversation was that we don't talk about sex at home. We
Yeah,
don't talk about
exactly. Yeah,
intimacy at home. We don't talk about good touch, bad touch, consent, all of these things. Why don't we smirk about something as simple as love with your parents? Because
yeah,
it's so normalized and it's so ingrained
yeah,
in us since we are babies basically. But
right,
nobody talks about it. Parents shy from it, and especially in India when we also have all of these uh, moral obligations that you're not supposed to show love or make love in front of two people.
right, yeah,
That's I think that's why people think it's something that we're not supposed to talk about and something to
right,
shy away from. And kids at our
yeah,
young age, we actually completely cannot blame them also. They're what, 12, 13, they're young, they have
true,
no
yeah,
idea why is it important to talk about it, and hence they end up teachers also probably just get uncomfortable and for the ease of it or for the comfort of it they just skip it because that's the easy possible way out.
yeah,
And
exactly.
that's why when you were talking about this program, there is another program and it reminds me of this was started approximately 4 5 years ago by government of
Hmm.
India, and it
Okay.
was brought in like in most of the schools to the main aim was to improvise the sexual and reproductive health. But the first thing that I would want to mention, it was named school health program.
Oh, okay.
It was named school health program, and if you read a lot of articles about it, a lot of people say that it has talked about reproductive health, it's talked about sexual health, but not really about pregnancies and
Right.
contraceptives and
Yeah.
abortions and all of those things. And since it's not tracked and there is no hard rule on how many sessions per week, what
Yeah.
target group should be exposed to this content, so there's of course an implementation failure, that we have no
Right.
idea. We know that the program was initiated, we know that some states and some schools have it, but we also know that there is no track record of it. And that's why
Right.
when we talk about this not having sexual and reproductive health, we also need to talk about which schools are having, which are talking about SRH. If you probably see an urban school with probably children from an higher economic or social status coming and attending
Yeah.
that school, you might expect, okay, that there will be some kind of sexual and reproductive health lessons.
Right.
But
Yeah.
like in my school, we never had it. And I'm
Right.
pretty sure that all schools in my city, I belong to a tier 2 city in Uttarakhand, and I'm pretty sure that none of our schools in the state still are exposed to
Right.
sexual and reproductive health. And that's very problematic, because I see all of these, because my younger brother is in that age now, and he's just turned 20, and when he was in 17, 18, he would tell me things, and I was just feel so hurt that people are actually talking about these things and they don't realize it. Even when the
Right.
thing of boys locker room that happened in 2020, that's
Yeah.
exactly why it happened, because
Right.
like we have created such a huge taboo about sex in general, that
Right.
people have their own misconceptions and assumptions about how to portray an opposite gender about it, and how to
Right.
probably portray them in a picture, how to talk to them. That's also very problematic, and I think we should really really work towards it.
Definitely. Before we continue this conversation further, we would like to take a short break and we'll be right back.
Hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Storytellers and Storytellers, Vineet talks to Chavi and Mohit, the couple behind Shitty Ideas Trending, about their creator journey. On Big Talks About Tiny Human, Meghna and Devi Shobha share strategies on how to deal with difficult behaviors of strong-willed children. On Pulyabasi, Pranay and Saurabh discuss why Indian students go abroad in large numbers for an MBBS degree. On Probation Se Promotion Tak, Abhinav tells us the benefits of self-marketing through writing for public forums. And on the Life Manifesto, Zarina discusses red flags, how we can identify them, and how we can deal with them. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. It really helps us. Don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms that you're listening to. And also remember, you can check us out on YouTube at www.ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Bank of Baroda, and HDFC Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Hello and welcome back. Priyal and I are in a conversation about having sex education in India. And before break, we were talking about how there is clearly a lack of sex education in schools in India and at home also. And why should it start at an early age? And what are the consequences that our population is facing these days? So, Priyal, now that we have spoken about India, do you have any idea about what is the state of sex ed in different countries? I know some countries have probably compulsorized in their curriculum, but do you have any idea about it?
Right. So I don't know about every other country in the world, but I see like two very extremes of sex education in two countries. Okay. One is the Dutch sex ed system, and the other one is the American sex ed system, right? Now, the Dutch sex ed system, which is from Netherlands, it follows like a proper comprehensive sex education curriculum. And in this curriculum, they start teaching the children as early as like 4 years old about what is sex and what is sexuality. And this conversation is not just limited to explicitly regarding acts of sex, but it also revolves around the whole concept of love, respect, and intimacy. And so that it builds each year to introduce children to different aspects of sexual health. So you start at a very young age and you give them the concepts that they can grasp for their age and for their brain development. And as they keep growing, the concepts keep getting deeper and deeper, and it covers multitude of topics regarding sexual health as a whole. They understand that sexual health is not just one small topic, but it includes plethora of topics that need to be discussed and that needs to sort of have a conversation, right? And if you actually, because of this, the result has also been very good with respect to this country. Netherlands actually has one of the lowest rates of teen pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases, and it is also one of the most gender equal countries in the world. And on the other hand, you have the American sex education system. This curriculum preaches abstinence from sex, it does not completely.
That's really surprising to me.
Yeah, I know, right? Because like even when I read about it, I was actually quite surprised, and but not at the same time, because I understand that teenage pregnancies and everything is quite high in America when compared to the other Western countries. Now it kind of makes sense, right? Because the curriculum here focuses less towards contraception methods, but more on just it just talks about like not having sex at all, and which is why I can understand why the number it is US is the number one spot for teen pregnancies amongst like the Western countries. And also it ranks, US is actually also ranks number one for sexually transmitted infections in teenagers among all the developed nations. And there are problems with respect to funding these sex education systems and all in USA, and I found all of this quite surprising. Like on one side you have Netherlands, which goes for a holistic approach, which understands that abstinence from sex is not the way to deal with sexual health, whereas then you have American system, which is completely abstaining from it. And I believe that somewhere it has to deal with a lot of the religious side of things, but that's just an assumption that I'm making with respect to abstinence.
Yeah, and like I don't know, in India, of course, I remember writing this op-ed about sex education 2 weeks back, and then I had posted it about Twitter. And if you see the comments on my post, they were also like that in India also they were speaking about how through my article I'm probably trying to harm India's culture, and this is not
Right,
how we talk about sex. Yeah.
which is quite surprising, right? Because like a land where a book called Kama Sutra, or the concept of Kama Sutra, came from, is shying away from having such an important conversation. And like this, like we previously discussed, no, like now people, now at least for us, like for now that we have internet and stuff, and there is obviously a surge in like sex ed based popular culture in terms of like the Netflix shows like sex education and stuff. But understanding it in Indian context is also very important, correct? Because whatever little knowledge we are sort of, or the teenagers today are getting through this pop culture, is not a holistic approach towards the whole education. They will sort of get half information about something, and there is so much of like misinformation spread. And obviously that brings me to another point, is also that a lot of teenagers today and a lot of young adults even shy away from going to gynecologists just to get like tested for sexually transmitted diseases.
I think it's
And
also because they are judged for doing that. I have not seen,
yeah,
like, I have heard so many examples, like, these gynecologists also, like, probably moral policing. This
yeah,
is
that is
all
definitely there.
yeah. And
Yeah,
yeah, you are
because
right. Go ahead, go ahead.
yeah, because even like in the medical curriculum, right, there is not like proper holistic approach towards it. Because when you as a woman go to a gynecologist, and the first question you are asked is, are you sexually active? And if you are an unmarried woman who is sexually active, you are looked through a lens of like pure a disgust. And that sort of makes people not want to go to a gynecologist and get like regular checkups done for their sexual health, which is actually something that every person should do at every given point in time. But
And
that doesn't happen. Yeah, go ahead.
no, I was saying, and that's why the data in sexual and reproductive health shows that India is lacking so behind. I remember there was this survey done by some institute in New York back 3 years back in 2019, and they said that
Huh.
more than 75% of abortions among Indian adolescents are unsafe, which actually
Right.
pose an like threat of complications and further even
Yeah.
deaths. And even if you talk
Yeah.
about HIV, the country of course, India ranks third in total number of HIV patients, and we know HIV is a sexually transmitted disease. And it's
Right.
so
Yes.
surprising when more than half the total population in India is under 25, and we
Yeah.
still don't talk about all of these things. And there have been, I know, private and public organizations here and there who have been trying to raise awareness amongst adolescents to
Yeah.
probably normalizing the idea of one's sexual and reproductive health. But the data clearly shows that our teenagers' health is at a huge risk. And that's why we need proper interventions at an early age for all of the children, irrespective of the socioeconomic backgrounds, to talk about and to discuss about one's sexual and reproductive health, which I would again want to highlight is just more, much more beyond just having sex. It's also
Yeah,
about,
and also
yeah,
like with respect to sexual health, also nowadays, whenever like these conversations happen, right, at least like with non-governmental organizations and everyone discussing about it, trying to give out information about it, it surrounds around menstrual health, not so much about safe sex practices. Menstrual health is part of like sexual health, yes, but like I like that it's commendable that India is currently doing it, and a lot of like private organizations are sort of like talking about it, but still it is not really enough, right?
yeah, and like you're still shying away, or it's probably even when you see it talking about contraceptives or things like that, you're only telling these
Yeah.
things to your target population, which are people who are married, and
Right.
that's
Yeah.
that's the target audience.
And even when you're talking about like couples, you're targeting only the cisgendered heterosexual couples. You're not
Exactly.
talking about queer community, or there is no inclusion of the queer community in these conversations, which is why the whole sexual identity and sexuality in itself is looked at such a foreign concept, which is why parents to this day have problem accepting their child if they are queer.
Exactly. And like, I don't think so. Even it's about parents, it's about oneself. Like a lot of people live in the closet forever because they're too
Right.
shy. Because at one point of time, it's not normalized for them. When at least when I was a child, I was taught that a girl marries
Yeah.
a boy and a boy falls in love with a girl. That's how
Yeah.
normal
Yeah.
people function. I remember Baba Ramdev making it. I was very young, and it's so vivid in my memory. There was some discussion about homosexuality in India, which this is a way older news, probably 10, 12 years older. And
Right. Huh.
I remember Baba Ramdev talking about it was aired on some television channel, and it was aired that he was saying that once if a person engages in a homosexual relationship, the chances of getting HIV increase. And I was so young at that point in age that for me it was true. Whatever I was
Yeah.
saying was true. And it's so problematic. Like you see all of these people whose probably orientation is not towards the opposite gender or who are
Right.
asexual in that matter. They don't
Yeah.
talk about these things. It's hard for them to accept their own identity and their own orientation. That it also
Yeah,
leads
and then
to
it
a lot.
leads to
Yeah,
whole whole societal conditioning, right? Because like you have not had these conversation with your parents or your close friends and everything. The sensitization towards like these communities has not happened, which is why you will still look at them through a certain very harsh lens, which is not okay.
yeah, correct. And like it also then leads to a lot of mental health problems that people
Definitely.
don't. Mental health is another neglected issue in our topic. Nobody wants to talk
Yeah.
about it. Nobody wants to address it. And
Right.
then I think it also leads to that sexual and reproductive health. I think should not only be concerned about just merely having sex. It's about much more beyond. I think it's about one self being healthy and leading a healthy lifestyle
Yeah.
and taking care of oneself. And that's why India needs
Definitely.
to invest more, probably move in the direction of having more sex education programs, either through public
Yeah.
service announcements, through community engagements, or through schools. I think it's the teachers and the parents' responsibility to let people be aware of one thing which is so common, which is so natural, which is the survival of one's being, which is the reason of one's
Yeah.
being. And then we don't talk about it, and that's why a lot of people, I have seen a lot of my acquaintances facing sexual and reproductive health issues because there was this massive unawareness about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
People
Yeah.
people engage, don't engage in sexual activities is another topic. That's one self-choice, but the idea of
Yeah.
consent, probably contraceptives, healthy relationships, decision making, maintaining
Yeah.
relationships, communication, healthy communication, all of that is to be taught to people at a very young age, so they also become very sensitive to these things and probably more respectful in their relationships. And I think that's also going to help people be engaged in more meaningful relationships. Now it's become
True.
so disrespectful that people really
Yeah.
don't care, and every time we blame it on the younger generation. But one also has to realize that we were supposed to taught these to learn these things when we were very young, and now we are just learning it
Yeah.
by our own experiences or probably through our friends
Yeah. Yeah.
or all of this pop culture thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It also like sort of like engaging in these conversations will sort of help individuals have like a holistic way of understanding the physical, mental, sociological aspect of sexual health, right? And that I think is extremely important.
Yeah, and I
Definitely.
correct, and I think now it's the right high time that if we want a healthier population, if we want our country to be healthy, we really need to go in that direction. Otherwise, and it's much more than just the bare minimum of good touch and bad touch as sex education. Apart
Yeah.
from these small programs in school, there was this one planned intervention that there should be these adolescent clinics, probably in health
Hmm.
centers and district hospitals, that are only meant for adolescents and their problems. And
Right.
when we know that India is still struggling with all of its social structures and systems, and we know that it's going to affect a lot of people, now to
Yeah.
sustain a healthy population in a longer term, we need more awareness, and we definitely need more counseling services so that it's easier for people who are vulnerable or people who are unaware at that point in time to get proper help and proper direction.
Definitely. And also, like, I think with respect to now that we're talking about like what can we do to sort of, address these issues, and you've spoken about all the methods that are being undertaken or the conversations that are going on. I think one important thing is when you're designing a curriculum for school and stuff, having a conversation with the relevant stakeholders, right? Like the teachers, the kids, as well as like the parents, because parents end up, especially in school under 18, when you're talking about, parents end up becoming the important stakeholders in this conversation. And because a lot of these previous programs did fail because there was a lot of moral policing from the parents itself, from the community. So indulging them in conversations and stuff would be one of the first steps to go about designing like a proper curriculum in
Yeah.
terms of sex education.
Yeah, correct. And also like implementation, it's we know it's going to be extremely hard uh for every school in this country to talk about sex education. It's going to be a very difficult task. So we know that implementation has to be focused on, tracking has to be done, some hard rules have to be set. And it's still in a very gray area in our country. We really have no data on how many classes are probably held in a week and what number of schools are having it or what target population is exposed to it. So I think that's also another point, that designing, programming, and then proper monitoring, then only we'll be able to evaluate
Right.
if it's actually impacting the health and if it's actually leading to more healthier adolescents and probably better sexual and reproductive health of young adults.
Definitely. Yeah, that is actually like a very important point. The whole like implementation and monitoring of it should be something that should be given very much importance, because that is something I think we tend to put out plans, but we don't seem to sort of understand how the implementation is going to happen. How are we going to keep track of like the development that has happened due to a certain change, right? So having that is extremely important. So, yeah, thank you so much, Mahek, for joining me in this conversation. I feel like this is one topic that we definitely needed to discuss, and
Yeah.
I'm
And I
glad
think
that
more people
we
should
could.
talk about it, and more parents
Yeah,
should
definitely.
probably engage in healthier conversations about one sexual
Definitely. Yeah,
reproductive
yeah,
health
yeah.
with the children. And hopefully we'll have healthier population in coming decades. That's what we can hope.
Definitely. I hope so. Fingers crossed. I hope that more people will start having this conversation and put aside their, stereotypical notions of this concept, right? Or this topic, that no, this should happen between certain people itself, and that, not talking about it is the best way to go about it. The entire silence regarding this topic or surrounding this topic is what is causing a lot of issues to to not just kids, right? Because they do not understand what sexual harassment is at that point, but also to adults who are not able to come out and say that they are having issues with respect to the sexual health, or even in case of harassment or anything that happens regarding the whole sexual health part of things. So this was a very important conversation, and I'm glad I got to talk to you about it. Yeah, and to our listeners, thank you for listening. This is Mahek and Priyal signing off. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Remember the days when our granny used to narrate once upon a time stories? Let's bring back the good old days of moral stories with Storytime Tamil. Hi, I am Ravishankar Balachandran, host of Storytime Tamil podcast. I would like you to entertain and educate your children with stories from Storytime Tamil. Tune in to the new episode sharp at 7 p.m. every day on IVM website, IVM podcast app, YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Don't you think that if everyone around you is getting smart, you better be smarter? Hey there, I'm the traveling professor Siddharth Deshmukh, and I'm back with season 2 of my podcast to make you smarter. Smarter with Sid. What's this season's focus about? Well, it's about 10-minute nuggets that will make you stand out at work. It's time to go from smart to smarter. Tune in every Tuesday and Thursday and become smarter with Sid.